So I'm welcome to the Gamma and to the lab, and I was just telling Carine and we've met several times in the Little Islam, so I'm very happy that she paid us a visit النهارده. I'm very excited to talk to you about this today and to hear your insights about attachment in that context. Carine is a child psychologist. She works at the Little Islam with the kids there. The Little Islam is an orphanage that follows a very specific and special modality of how they do things, and she'll talk to us about this today. I don't think this is the common model that you would hear in orphanages in Egypt, and I'm really, really happy that this is taking place and it's happening أصلاً. Very happy that Carine will talk to us about this. You also work برا the Little Islam, صح كده? You also see children. Age range ايه تقريبا that you see?
I actually see adults and children. It depends on who's coming. I see children as young as maybe 4 up to adulthood. That's also part of the private practice that I do on the side.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So can we start by you telling us a little bit about the Little Islam, what it is for those of us who don't know about it, and what do you do there, and what's the philosophy that you try to follow there?
Sure. First of all, I want to say thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. It's great to be back at AUC after so many years. And to be with you guys especially, it's even more special. As Noor said, yes, I work at the Little Islam, and it is an orphanage so the vision and mission of the place is that they believe that, they want to break the stigma of orphaned and vulnerable children, and they feel that if they empower them with the right education, the right parenting, the right environment, that they will then reach their full potential and become contributing members of society. So they're enrolled when they come in, and they come in because they've been exposed to abuse, neglect, unsafe environments, things like that, and we bring them into the organization. And we then enroll them in schools depending on their needs and their abilities, and we provide them with opportunities to play sports and to develop skills and talents and things like that. And we offer mental health support, so that's usually done through psychologists such as myself and some of my colleagues. We provide individual psychotherapy mainly. There was a time when I did some social skills groups, and I think that was something that was very much needed and a lot of fun to do, but I'm not really doing that right now. And then the other thing that I do is that I provide guidance to the caregivers there. So there we talk about attachment, we talk about trauma and the impact of trauma on attachment, and we talk about different parenting techniques and what to do and things like that. The kids, when they come in, they are sort of placed in different apartments. We have 13 apartments, and each apartment has 6 to 9 kids approximately. And they have 2 to 4 caregivers taking care of them, and we try to make sure that they are the same caregivers who come in every single week, because we're trying to foster that attachment with these caregivers who would hopefully give them that corrective emotional experience.
Okay, that's a very nice brief about the whole model that you follow there. I'm going to ask specifically about the fact that kids at the Little Islam, they are allowed to see their parents, and that their parents actually in many, many cases, their biological parents are there, and they still are part of the Little Islam. How does that work, and what is the rationale behind this? Why do you think it's important for them to be in touch with their parents, and also how can that be a challenge? Because it can be important, but it can also be a challenge for some kids. It might be confusing. It's a very different type of content. So how do you deal with that as well?
Yes, this is a very complicated piece because our kids come in because of abuse or neglect or unsafe living environments, not just because both of their parents are deceased. So that means that the parents could be there, however we get consent from them, to welcome the kids and for them to live there. And so we are very keen on not cutting ties with their parents. I think it's already very difficult for the kids to be separated from their parents, and a lot of them experience that as abandonment. So if you think about our kids, the first layer of challenges that we face is the trauma that they've endured, right? And the effects of that complex trauma, even it's not necessarily a single incident of trauma, it's more complicated than that because usually it's repeated exposure to trauma. And so that complex trauma is the first layer that we have, and then the second layer on top is the separation from the parents and that feeling of abandonment, sometimes betrayal, sometimes feelings of shame. So there's a lot that we kind of deal with right off the bat with these kids. And I think, as you would probably imagine, who your parents are plays a huge role in who you are. And especially when you're a child, I always like to use that metaphor of being like a fruit tree, an apple tree, an orange tree, whatever. And I always believe that the kids believe that they are the fruit from that tree. So if their family is a bad tree, they automatically believe that they are bad, and vice versa. So we try to encourage the idea that it's not that your parents are bad or anything like that. We really try to make it a point not to make the parents out as villains, because that would reflect on their sense of identity and who they are. So we're very cautious about that, but we also have to be very clear and transparent about why they are actually here, because we're trying to reverse the impact of the feelings of abandonment and betrayal. And that comes also with the idea that I must be bad or unlovable, and especially if there are other kids in the home. So we don't always take all of the kids in the family. It varies depending on sometimes the sex of the child and sometimes on the age of the child. So when there are other kids living there, that complicates matters even more. They feel like, why are they with my parents and I'm not? And it must be because I was bad, or because I'm not lovable, I'm not good enough, or any of that. So all of this package then has to be kind of reversed in the work that we do with them. It's a lot for us to try to do, but we really...
This is very complicated because on the one hand, you want to make the child feel like they are not bad and their parents are not bad because they would feel that they're bad, like you said, but also you want to explain that it's better for them to be here. It's one thing to say your parents are not bad, and it's another to say, but they're still not fit, or they're still not qualified, or this is not the environment for you to be in. It's a very confusing thing for a child to understand, and the younger they are, the more confusing it is, I guess, because okay, you're saying they're okay, they're not bad, then why can't I be just with them? So it's very complicated to try and balance this in a way that doesn't affect the child's self-esteem in a negative way. And I can imagine, and I know from the stories that you told me before, how when the child goes to visit the parents, because that's again something you encourage for them to be in touch with the parents, when they come back to a very different kind of context and environment, they're very confused. What kind of behaviors come up frequently? What happens in that transition? How do the kids deal with that, and how do you cope with that? Help them forward that.
So a lot of the times if the kids go on visits, and sometimes some of them are allowed to go on overnight visits, when they return, we experience difficulties related to like regressions, basically. So some milestones actually the kids regress in. So that's one of the major challenges that we experience when they go back, and trying to kind of reinstill the hope in the caregivers that this is just like a setback and they're going to get back to that point. So not to kind of lose hope that all the work that they put into whatever milestone that they were trying to achieve with this child was like starting from scratch. I'm always like, it's not starting from scratch, it's just a setback. and they're going to get back there. So that's one of the major issues that we face. But another thing is complying with some of the rules that are set in place. So we have rules about how much screen time these kids have, what they can eat, how many sweets they get, and how late they sleep. All of these things are regulated at the organization, but at home, especially during holidays, you know, rules are a lot more lenient. So they end up, you know, having more sweets or more screen time or sleeping later, and we see a lot of pushback there. There's a lot of pushing of limits and things like that. I think the kids also, especially the first day that they're back, and some of them take much longer to regulate than others, but some of it's reliving the separation all over again. It's reliving the abandonment. I think that's the most challenging piece of them feeling like, you know, it was so nice to be there, it was so nice to be amongst them, and now I have to, it's almost as if they're being re-traumatized with the separation. It's very heavy for them. So we have a lot of like sleepless nights sometimes, a lot of tears, you know, and sometimes tantrums, just like throwing tantrums about why they're back and things like that. Some of them are happy to be back, especially if there was like, you know, some more traumas there. You know, that uncle or the dad or some violence or, you know, a mishap even. Sometimes we've had incidents that we didn't account for occur. There was like, I think, a shooting one time in the neighborhood where one of the kids' families lived. And that was very scary for the kids, and we had to bring them back right away. So we have to deal with a lot of that, you know, re-traumatization and being triggered by being back and being abandoned again.
When you're talking about this, the researcher in me is wondering if it's generally better from your observations for kids who have parents and who are in contact with their parents and who go and spend time or even spend the night with their parents and come back, in their ability to cope and adjust to this environment, or the kids who know that khalas, this is where I am, I have nowhere else to be, and I need to adjust once and for all, versus the kids who have to go back and forth. From your observation of that, how do you see the difference here? I know it's definitely it's not a generalizable kind of thing, definitely it depends on the child, but generally speaking, what are your thoughts on that?
I think both of them aren't really ideal, honestly, because yes, I've definitely observed where, you know, moments where the kids who go to their families and feel like, you know, hey, this is a place I can really, really live in. Like, why am I not there? And they come back super confused, a lot of conflict, not really getting why they were abandoned in the first place. So that's a child who struggles a lot with making peace with the fact that they have been, you know, abandoned in their eyes by their families, right? And then you have the other kids who don't necessarily have parents and don't necessarily get these visits, but they also feel inferior to the other kids who go. So
because at least they have somewhere to go temporarily.
Yes, yes. And there seems to be this like implicit sort of status, right? The more like I can come back and share stories about what we've done and where we've been and what I brought back, sometimes sweets and things like that. It makes me look more important than you, who stayed here and didn't get to do all of these things. And so they hide from each other the truth of how difficult it was to be there, or, you know, what they went through and things, just to kind of keep that, you know, prestige almost of what they got. And a lot of the young ones really unconsciously doing that, they try to protect their families. They want to protect their family's image. So they never want anything bad to be said about them, because it makes them look bad. So they try to protect that image of how amazing they are and how they had a wonderful time and things, and that's rubbing into the child who didn't go. And it makes them feel like their families are actually not great. However, they're much more maybe adjusted, but still there's another set of conflict of why don't I even get to go. So that's another challenge.
It's very complicated because each one of them has kind of, as you said, their own set of challenges and struggles. And given that you work with kids who come from very disrupted backgrounds, from an attachment perspective, they have lots of attachment wounds going on. I want to ask this question regarding two things. Regarding you as a therapist, when you work with them in therapy context, what do you think comes up, and how does that show up in their relationship with you, and also with the caregivers in the Little Islam? Like, what kind of things come up with the caregivers, given that these kids come from a specific kind of background?
Right. So let's go back to the idea of like the multiple layers. So we have the first layer of complex trauma, which makes it difficult for the child to trust people, to trust the world, and therefore trust themselves and feel worthy. They tend to have feelings of shame, and so that disrupts also their ability to build healthy relationships, right? So that's one layer, and then we have the second layer of being separated and abandoned, and that also makes them feel like they can't trust people, they don't feel necessarily safe, and it kind of digs deeper, this idea that they are inferior to others, they're not worthy, they're not lovable. Okay, so what does that look like in our kids? So basically, one of the main things is their inability to trust. So we work really hard on building trust first. We try to provide consistent, predictable care and nurturance first. Everything we say, we try to kind of we keep our word always with these kids. We try never to say anything that we don't think we're going to be able to implement or do. So we're very cautious about the language that we use in that sense. We try to help them feel safe again. So in treatment, it takes a really, really, really long time for me to feel like a child has really built rapport with me. Okay? Much longer than it would in any other setting. So the building rapport piece takes a really long time, and sometimes the child might want me to think that they trust me, and in reality there's so much that's going on in the background that they believe I don't know about necessarily. So there's a lot of like that facade that they have, and they're not really able to be their true self for so many reasons, right? They don't feel safe enough. So the kids who come first are the perfect kids, right? As soon as they come, they're like people pleasing, they're like the best kid you can ever have, and the caregivers are so excited about this new child who just came, and they're like so well behaved, and you know, I've helped the caregivers recognize that this is really just because they just came and they feel like they need to win our love and care first.
And they're scared.
They're so scared.
What would happen if I'm not? Because potentially in their background, it was scary to not be that perfect child.
Exactly. So once they start building trust and feeling safer, then we start to see the misbehavior. Mm-hmm. And that's a moment where the caregivers and I are like, yes! Mm-hmm. That's where it is. And usually not the new caregivers look at us and they're like, what are you talking about? They're misbehaving. And I'm like, no, that's good. That's what you want to see. You want to see that misbehavior because you want them to start showing their true colors and really what's going on in there, because if they don't, then we don't have anything to work with. So the more they show, the more we're able to work with something and really help them, right? So these people-pleasing kids, and especially those who maintain that for a long period of time, to us, they are the scariest, because you're like, you don't know what's really, really in there. And we work very hard to try to get to that place with them. So that's part of the challenge that I see in my work with them in therapy, but also with the caregivers. So when caregivers change, that's an interesting one also. When caregivers change, because it's a job at the end of the day, and sometimes there are changes that happen. The new caregiver who comes in is usually tested a lot. the kids push her to her very, very limits just to see, what you being angry and provoked looks like. Are you going to beat us? Are you going to shame us? Are you going to abandon us? What are you going to do? And it's so much easier for us to push you to that limit, to get you to that point, and to see it sooner rather than later. They don't do well with change given their trauma, right? Kids who've been exposed to trauma do not like anything that's not predictable. It's scary to them. So when that changes, they are very scared. And in order to kind of regain that control, we have to push you to your limits until you show us your true colors also. And once we've seen that, then we can kind of build trust, or you leave because you end up losing it, you end up doing like something that's not acceptable or something like that, and then you're not fit to be a caregiver. So it's very challenging. I would say maybe the first year for a caregiver is one of the most challenging years at the organization because of like the number of trials that they're put in. And honestly, in treatment, I'm also always kind of feeling like I'm being tested sometimes. And these kids, they do that. They test you. They do something. They tell you something, and they wait to see if someone else finds out about it, or they drop something here, and then they kind of wait and see what your reaction is and things like that. So it requires a lot of mental energy here to try to predict like what they need to hear and whether I failed the test or passed it, and it keeps you on your toes.
Yeah. Do you also think that part of testing the caregivers and testing you as a therapist also has to do with reconfirming their beliefs about themselves? Like if I get my caregiver to hit me or to yell or to do a certain kind of behavior that would reconfirm my beliefs about myself as not being worthy, as being a bad kid, then that's safe because it's what I know and it's what I can expect, and kind of this part as well.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting because sometimes you see the child really wanting to get that reaction out, like they actually actively work to get that reaction from the
caregiver. At least they know what that looks like. At
what
least they
that
can
is,
deal with
yes.
that.
They can deal with it so much better. They try to get the caregiver to that point. And it's almost as if they are rejecting that, a corrective emotional experience and different kind of parenting that is so unfamiliar to them. But yeah, for sure.
That's very, very interesting. I'll leave some space for questions, but
Yes, I have a question. So how do you deal with the caregiver changing? Because I believe this is something you're trying to avoid as much as possible.
Yes.
So and as you said, it's a job at the end of the day. So when they leave, do you take some days to prepare the kids, or how do you also frame it? Like, why are she leaving? Am I wrong, or did I do something wrong, or is it about me or not?
Yes, absolutely. So we definitely prepare the kids for these kinds of changes. So when we know that a caregiver is leaving, we try to give them a few days, and I coach the caregivers about, how to have maybe some kind of goodbye sort of party or something like that, so that goodbyes are seen as more healthy than they are just sudden abrupt changes, which mimics what they've been through when they've been separated from their families. So we talk about also what to say to them. So they're kind of used to the idea that, especially the younger caregivers, once they're engaged to be married, everyone's kind of prepared that, once she's married, she's not going to be able to spend the night here anymore and do that kind of work. So the kids know, and sometimes they even generalize that rule to anybody, really. So if, when I was getting married, there was this idea that I wouldn't be working there anymore, even though there's no need for that, right? But they've kind of generalized that idea of getting married equals you not working here anymore and therefore leaving. And so just the idea of marriage sometimes freaks them out, and we have to, talk to them about how that's not always the case, but they're kind of used to, caregivers leaving for that specific reason. So they can anticipate it, and interestingly, they talk about old caregivers for years and years after that. They really remember them. They don't forget about them. Caregivers try to promise to come back and visit. I'm always very cautious about that. I'm like, if you can't promise, like if you can't keep that promise, don't promise that. So we've had some who've been able to come maybe a couple of times, things like that, but we're kind of cautious around that goodbye process.
You mentioned that the first year is the most hard one. How do you deal with that? I believe each child comes with like misconceptions. So for example, they might misunderstand them being beaten with that this is for مثلا لمصلحتك أو ما عشان خايف عليك أو this is love, or for example being yelled at as something normal or something they do to receive love or to receive at least acceptance. So they might feel discomfort with gentleness.
Yes.
So they might need you to act in the same way their parents or their caregivers acted and to feel safe with you, because this is what they used to, even if it's not right, even if it's not the right thing to do at all. So how do you deal with that? And how do you shift this misconceptions without losing their trust? Because their trust might be like being beaten or being yelled at, their comfort zone.
Yes, we get into that cycle maybe for years and years and years of the kids seeking a specific response from the caregivers, which is, as you mentioned, more familiar to them and maybe safer. But I think the very important piece that we put in is also like the firm limits as much as possible. We're very big on the idea of consequences. They need to know how their behavior impacts other people. And especially it's such a big community. So the impact that one behavior has can be like really big depending on the behavior itself. So we try to really like hone in on that idea of like consequences and things like that. They know, and I think the caregivers explicitly state that they're not going to hit them, because some kids are like, hit me, and the caregiver's like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that kind of thing. So I think they also really learn from each other what goes down here, at the organization. They kind of learn from the other kids, like how things work and how things go, especially if they're able to build relationships right off the bat. And you sometimes see the kids, like the one who might make a mistake and get in trouble, sort of spirals, makes like a number, it kind of like all hell breaks loose, and it's just like, khalas, I'm gonna get the beating. And so it's like mistake after mistake after mistake. It's impulsive, and it's a very interesting process to watch sometimes, and we understand that it comes from that feeling of fear from what's to come. And every time you're going to respond differently, they're going to recognize that, okay, this is a different kind. They're all very skeptical though that a stranger can love me when my parents didn't. That's what they believe, right? So we have to be very conscious about the idea also that it's not that your parents don't love you, either. It's that they aren't able to take care of you right now. They have some challenges in being able to protect you and take care of you. So that's usually the language that we try to use, hoping that, we're just kind of planting seeds and hoping that this will grow some kind of fruit or whatever.
Yeah. I want to take that back to therapy. As a therapist now, I'm thinking, one of the biggest challenges of therapists is to work with someone, adults in that case, who have adverse childhood experiences in general, some kind of an attachment disruption, particularly here if we're talking about that, and to help them process what happened without having the person put a lot of blame or feel a lot of resentment towards the parents, while also eventually, it's a long process, eventually making peace with that and kind of forming their own narrative of what happened in their childhood.
Mm-hmm.
As a therapist who also works with adults, I don't know if any of these adults were previously kids in alternative care settings or no?
No, actually.
But still, yani adults who
yeah.
have similar kind of issues in different contexts, what do you think is important to keep in mind here? Especially when you're working with these kind of issues again, and people very frequently get stuck in forming a narrative that is based on blaming the parents or feeling like they've done me wrong or they couldn't take care of me or there was some kind of abuse, any of these scenarios. How do you reach that balance as a therapist to try and help the person process this while also eventually forming a narrative that works for you?
Yeah. Well, I think definitely one of the major influences on what I think about this issue comes from a book that I've read, Trauma and Recovery. I don't know if you're familiar with it. But I think the first step is grieving my past, grieving what I lost, what I didn't get as a child. I think I even do that with the kids starting now, like, you know, when some of them are really able to talk about these kinds of things, then we're able to talk about how, you know, they don't have what other kids have. They see that at school all the time, so it's really, really tough for them to be faced with that reality all the time at school. So we talk about how, you know, their life is different from other kids. It always will be. And just because it's different doesn't make it worse, better or worse. It's not about that. It's really just different. And then we kind of have to grieve what they missed out on, what they never got. And they experience that even through the different transitions in life, right? The different milestones. So, first day of college for one of my kids was brutal. She ended up like failing the first semester, taking the second semester off, and then re-enrolling in a different university. But the image that got stuck in her mind was when she was at a different orphanage with a carer who was abusive, and she remembers the first day of school and that carer telling her عقبال ما أشوفك في الجامعة or عقبال أول سنة جامعة or something like that. And her first day of college was just all of these like memories of the previous abuse, and we had to kind of process all of these things, and it would show up in like nightmares, and it would show up in like, you know, some form of hallucinations-ish, of imagining that she, you know, someone's there in her room or something like that, and that had to do with one of her major traumas, something that she hadn't necessarily spoken to me about in like the 3 years of treatment that we had been together. So as sort of a person, whether a child or an adult, goes through these different transitions in life, I think it brings up some of these memories, and then you kind of have to process and grieve for that first. And then I think you can, and it reminds me of like the stages of grief. I always kind of also go back to that, the anger and the denial and the depression, and then eventually maybe the acceptance, and kind of going through that cycle over and over again in different directions and ways.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and the fact that it's an ongoing process is also interesting to mention. It's not a destination that you reach. It's probably something that will be re-triggered at different points, and then very interesting. Any questions?
Unrelated, I was curious about the siblings dynamic. They live as siblings in an apartment, so I think they reach out to you to try to choose who lives with who, and that must be really complex. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, that is a very, very difficult process of trying to choose, you know, which kids are more compatible. When I first started there, maybe there was just the first floor, so maybe like 5 apartments then, and then we kind of gradually built up the apartments depending on the kid, like recruiting new kids kind of thing. We've had to make different moves, and we match that according not only to the kids, but also to the caregivers. So if we think that this caregiver is going to work really well based on our knowledge of this caregiver and also of the child in question, then we might make like these minor sort of moves just to kind of support them in a different kind of way. We really try to minimize these moves. They're very dysregulating for the kids, probably also triggering for them. And they're dysregulating for the rest of the kids also, receiving them a new sort of personality in there and introducing different kind of dynamics and things like that. So we really, really try to minimize that, and especially if there's conflict with that child and caregiver, because we don't want to promote the idea of when there's a rupture, there's no room for repair. And therapy is really built on that idea that we can have conflict and then repair that in a way, or the idea even that, you know, you abandon me or remove me from this place because I'm bad. So we're very cautious about these messages not getting to the kids first, and then we kind of try to match, and it's trial and error to a very, very big extent. A lot of what we do at the Little Islam is trial and error. We try and it fails sometimes, and we're just like, okay, regroup, let's do it differently. And I feel like it's a very important parallel process for our caregivers to see that in working with these kids, it's all about trial and error. It's not one way of being like perfect. We're trying to encourage that growth mindset more than like just getting it right the first time.
So you talked about consequences and like, but at the same time you don't want to punish. So how do you do, can you talk about more about what consequences do you make, especially when they like go very, very off limit and
Yes.
you have to make consequences but you don't want to punish them, so how do you do that?
Yeah, so I guess I'm not very big on like the terminology, because to me some of them are actual punishments, right? But we try to encourage the concept of natural, logical consequences to the issue. So, for example, there was a very concerning behavior of a child pooping on themselves repeatedly and hiding their underwear in like the closet. And at first, as a psychologist, of course, that's super concerning. I'm like, there's a huge psychological issue there, and I was really, really worried about that. And so we had him talk to the doctor on site and things like that to evaluate whether, probably like 8. So way past, and you know, they're done with like the toilet training and all of that, and no kind of bedwetting or any issue like that. But for it to be in caprices, like pooping, that's concerning, okay? The caregiver, after a couple of weeks, he came in and he's like, listen, I did something, I'm really sure if that's right or wrong, but kind of took care of the problem, okay? And that's very recent, so I don't know if like what he did will backfire in a different direction. However, it took care of the problem for now, and he was like, I just had him clean 2 of his underwear. You know, maybe I shouldn't have done this. Like, he was really like anxious about it, and I was like, listen, it seems like a natural consequence of like doing something. It's not about punishing them. You know, he wasn't like yelling at the child. He wasn't like, you know, harsh with him. He wasn't shaming him. None of that. It was just simply, I think you need to wash your underwear, you know. And after washing a couple of his underwear, he stopped. And it's a bit of a weird like fix. You're like, is this going to backfire? But really, all you're trying to do is that, okay, when you know, do something, you're just gonna have to clean it up. You're gonna have to fix it. So that's the concept that we try to do. Not all situations allow for that. One of the things that I taught the caregivers, and sometimes it backfires, is the idea of taking a timeout. not even the like chair timeout kind of idea, but just kind of finding a calming corner. Usually that's their bedroom. They have to go into their room, wait until they regulate, and then, you know, come out and then talk about it and then see how they're gonna fix it and things like that. But now some of the kids, as soon as they hear like you're gonna go to your room, they're like, ah! And it's just like some of the caregivers are like, all I just need is for you to calm down. Like, and so sometimes I'm like, you know, they can color, they can do this, they can do that, but the old-fashioned ingrained punishment mentality is still really, really pleasant. They're like, yeah, but they were happy like doing this. And I'm like, well, the point isn't to make them miserable. We're not trying to torture them. That's not the idea. It's just simply, let's do something to help you regulate, and then we can talk about it. So, you know, we kind of try to practice these kinds of things. Sometimes we have to take away the tablet, take away allowance, all punishments, right? No TV, you know, typical sort of punishments, especially if it's really hard for there to be a natural consequence to the behavior, right? Sometimes they're deprived on going on trips, things like that. And sometimes we try to connect it, like, if you're not able to respect your peers, or, you know, if you're not able to sit properly on the bus, or if you're not able to, then this is what needs to happen. Or you can't be around other kids when you're not able to control that. Or you need like higher supervision until you're able to modify your behavior, that kind of thing. So I really try to introduce the idea of being more supportive, so offering more help for the child to correct the behavior, but the little punishment mentality seeps in sometimes, and I guess that's normal. You know, we try to be just good enough parents. That's it. That's all we need to do. So that helps.
I know that like every child's reaction to coming to the institution is different. So I'm wondering, did you deal with something like a child being extremely attached to a caregiver with you personally? Because for them, like one of them might be it's not familiar with like being in the institution and like avoiding you, but also some of them might feel like extremely safe for the first time, and they become like so attached to you, for example, or extremely attached to you. So how do you deal with something like that? Like it's not the average or normal attachment.
Yeah. So actually, I'm not very involved with the newcomers just yet. I always kind of leave the primary caregivers taking care of the kids, to focus on just kind of helping them feel safe and things like that. I think that what we see a lot of, though, is the indiscriminate attachment. So everyone is like, mom, you know, I'll hold on to you, and then maybe I'll hold on to you, and there's no that preferential sort of person that I really want to hold on to, and it's understandable. And I think the changes in caregivers, you know, leads to that to a very big extent. We do have a situation though where a child came when she was 6 months old, and she's been with the same caregiver since, and now she is 3.5 or 4. So this is a dyad that we're very like intentional about not separating. Both are very attached to each other, and I think you see it with the caregiver working with that caregiver. So let's call them caregiver 1 and caregiver 2. So number 1 is the one who's been with her since she was 6 months old. For caregiver 2, it's very hard for her to like form a relationship with this child. Sleep is very challenging for this caregiver. Behaviors are sometimes super different between caregivers. So you can see the impact of that attachment with caregiver 1 versus caregiver 2, who's still trying to build that kind of, and it's very frustrating for that caregiver who is struggling a lot with that attachment, trying to be as understanding as possible, about why this relationship is so strong, and it makes a lot of sense. But it's also very challenging for her to do her work, and sometimes there's a lot of conflict between them, and you know, you see behaviors that you usually don't see when the other one's around. And that's the case also sometimes at school. The caregivers feel like, why do they only behave when I'm there? And if I'm not there, they're misbehaving. And I think for our kids, it's really important to build that connection with them. They really, really need that. And it's so hard to build as well. Our KG1 kids are causing mayhem right now in schools. Just, they are the most problematic ones we have. It's their first experience of school, and they're just like, you know, they went to nursery, but school is a different story, and the teachers are going crazy. They're just like, something help us. So yeah, that's...
There is a debate in the literature and some studies about adults who were adopted themselves and whether they make good caregivers in terms of adopting kids. In terms of the caregivers in the Little Islam, I don't know if this applies to anyone, but what are your thoughts on that? If a caregiver comes from a background of similar trauma than the trauma he's seeing in the children he's dealing with or she's dealing with, do you think that is something that helps them deal, connect with the kids in a better way? It's easier for them to connect to these kids, or is it easier for them to be triggered by these kids?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
I probably see more of the caregivers being triggered by the kids, especially if there's any kind of similarity in their stories, but there's also sometimes projection. So that projection sometimes really makes it difficult for the caregivers to see the child for who they actually are. So it also depends on how much therapeutic support these caregivers have gotten. So some of my colleagues actually, they don't do the guidance work that I do with the caregivers, and they provide individual therapy for the caregivers. So we provide that there. And you know, I try not to get into details about their personal lives because that would be kind of crossing a professional boundary. But I can tell when I feel like a caregiver is triggered by certain behaviors, by a child. And because some of our kids have been through sexual abuse, we also see sexualized behaviors. And I can tell some of the caregivers who really struggle with children touching themselves or touching other kids or taking their clothes off or self-stimulating or any of these behaviors. They're very sometimes difficult for some of our caregivers to handle that. So we try to work together on this and how to handle this. I try to provide as many trainings and resources as I can to help them navigate these issues. So I think, to answer your question in one sentence, I think it really depends on the caregiver's treatment history. Yeah. Have they been to therapy or not?
Our time is almost up, so we can take one more question.
You had a question earlier, but I don't know if you answered it.
I have a question because I've been to the Little Islam before. For the situation where for example, if the mother or the actual caregiver of the children, if they want to take them back,
yes,
or if the children decide to go back to their houses, do you do a follow-up or something like that, or do you cut ties by all means?
Well, unfortunately, I think depending on the circumstances of their departure, we do cut ties. We have a department for that, so if there is for any reason any kind of contact, that department is the one who contacts these families, and maybe these families even call them back sometimes and stuff. So I think it's a fine line between being manipulated by some of the families sometimes, and like playing ping pong regarding like taking them, bringing them back, taking them, bringing them back. We've had these situations happen before, and it's really, really difficult for the child. So I think as a policy, we try to keep the cutting ties, just to avoid that kind of confusion and for them to feel the weight of the decision. You know, it's not a decision that I just kind of take impulsively and then, you know, undo like this. You know, this is like the lives of your children, their emotions, their psychological development. There's a lot at stake, and sometimes they don't understand that. So that's why we try to be firm here for them to feel the weight of the decision, really.
What if the child is not wanting to completely go back, and they are, for example, teenagers or like grown up?
So they have the option once they turn 18 to do so. Rare situations that led to kids not being at the organization when they're younger, based on their choice, just because they might have put the entire community in like some kind of danger or negatively affecting them. So we try to be very transparent with you know, the community as a whole, the kids and the caregivers, about how your behaviors might have an impact on the entire community. We are an organization under like certain laws and things like that. So if there is a serious incident, this place might be closed down, and it might be because of something that one of you does. So they kind of have to carry that responsibility as well. And I feel like, and that's been the most difficult piece for me to crack, I think that's fostering a little bit more of a sense of belonging. I think that's something I've really struggled to get to with these kids, is why there isn't really a sense of belonging to the community. And I feel like the accountability might be the actual key to that. So it's taken me a while to get there.
One last question before we wrap up. If any of them wants to volunteer in the Little Islam or any other orphanage and want to help out with kids and institutional care in general, can you give a couple of do's and don'ts for things that you would recommend? Because sometimes we have very good intentions, we want to be there, we want to help, so we say things or we promise things and stuff like that. And I know that you have thoughts on that, Tammy.
Yeah, I think one of my big do's, I guess, is being very mindful of like physical boundaries. I think some people who come, they want to take like carry the kids or put them on their laps or, you know, tickle them and things like, and that might be very dysregulating to kids who've been exposed to sexual abuse especially. So we're very cautious about that. I think that we're cautious about sometimes talking, you know, about orphanage or things like that. They call it Bird Rock home, so it's really a home for them. On social media, we say a lot the word orphanage, and they see it and they know it and they hear it from people in the community and things like that. But some of them might get offended. It's very interesting. Some of them get offended even from like saying their father's name. It's kind of like, you know, you're talking about my family, how dare you like speak a word about my family kind of thing. So they have a lot of misconceptions about, you know, what we do and say and why. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind and be aware of. I would probably say definitely follow the lead of the people there. You know, they know what they're doing. And so if you follow what they're doing, you're probably on the right track. I would be cautious about intruding about anything, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So if you see conflict or a child crying or something like that, I think the least you can, or the maximum you should do, is just offering comfort, you know? But trying to solve the situation or something like that might mess something up that the caregiver is trying to work on. So make sure you don't intrude in that way. And I think for our organization especially, they usually welcome volunteers, welcome a lot of volunteers, but usually around like structured activities, just to reduce that kind of mishap. So you want to come in and tutor English, you know, or study with someone science, or, you know, do some kind of activity or sports, or, you know, things like that, more than welcome. And the structure of the activity provides the appropriate boundaries for that. You're coming in as a staff member, as a teacher, as something like that. And so it takes care of like that gray area of wanting to get too involved with the child, getting too attached to them, or learning more details about like their lives or something like that. So
Thank you so much. This is very interesting. Then when we talk about these topics, I'm fascinated with your thoughts and what you do, and I think it's very, very important. We don't talk about this enough. I'm glad that you shed light on so many interesting points today.
thank you so much for having me. I always love having these discussions with you guys. They're so insightful and very enjoyable for me. So thank you so much.